The rhythmic sound of cleaning rods scraping through rifle barrels filled the armory at Camp Harrison as Sarah Martinez methodically worked through her daily quota. At 26, she had perfected the art of invisibility. Average height, dark hair always pulled back in regulation style, wearing the same Navy coveralls as every other civilian contractor on the base. Her movements were efficient but unremarkable, the kind of steady competence that kept supervisors satisfied without drawing unwanted attention. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had been working the weapons maintenance contract at Camp Harrison for 11 months now, ever since she'd driven her beaten Honda Civic through the gates of the sprawling Nevada installation with nothing but a duffel bag and a carefully constructed resume. The job posting had been straightforward: weapons cleaning technician, security clearance not required, previous military experience preferred but not mandatory. It was exactly what she needed: honest work that paid the bills while keeping her far from the spotlight she'd once occupied. The morning routine never varied. Badge in at 0630 hours, coffee from the break room vending machine, check the work assignment board, and claim a station in the back corner of the facility where the fluorescent lights flickered just enough to discourage casual observation. Sarah preferred that corner for reasons she couldn't fully explain to herself. Maybe it was the clear sight lines to both exits, or perhaps the way the shadows fell across her workstation, making it harder for anyone to get a close look at her neck where her collar occasionally shifted during the day. "Morning, Martinez," called Jennifer Walsh, a chatty contractor in her 40s who'd taken it upon herself to be the facility's unofficial social coordinator. "A big shipment came in from the training ranges yesterday. Looks like the new recruits have been putting the M4s through their paces again." Sarah managed a polite smile while checking her assignment sheet. Fresh recruits always do. Takes time to learn proper weapon handling. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd once been responsible for teaching weapon handling to people who would never officially exist in any military database. The weapons maintenance facility at Camp Harrison processed equipment from 3 different training commands, making it one of the busiest such operations in the Southwest. Located in a secure zone that required special clearance to access, the building housed everything from standard-issue rifles to specialized equipment that civilian contractors weren't supposed to ask questions about. Sarah had learned to focus on her assigned weapons and ignore the locked cases that occasionally passed through her area of responsibility. Staff Sergeant Monica Chen emerged from the supervisor's office carrying a steaming mug of coffee and the perpetually harried expression of someone managing too many moving parts with insufficient resources. At 32, Chen ran the day shift with military precision, tempered by the practical reality that half her workforce consisted of civilian contractors with varying levels of motivation and expertise. "Martinez," Chen called out, consulting her clipboard, "I'm putting you on the priority rack today. We've got a batch of weapons that came back from desert training exercises in pretty rough condition. Think you can handle the extra workload?" "Absolutely, Sergeant," Sarah replied, already moving toward the designated area. The priority rack was exactly what it sounded like, a workstation reserved for equipment that required more than routine maintenance. Sometimes it was gear damaged during training accidents, other times weapons that had been exposed to extreme environmental conditions. Today's batch looked like they'd been buried in sand for a week. Sarah set up her workspace with methodical precision, arranging cleaning supplies, specialized tools, and inspection equipment in an order that maximized efficiency. Other contractors might have seen the task as tedious overtime work, but Sarah found something almost therapeutic about the process of taking something damaged and restoring it to perfect operational condition. There was a purity to mechanical work that had been absent from her previous career, where success was measured in lives saved rather than weapons cleaned. The first rifle she selected was an M4A1 carbine, caked with fine desert sand that had worked its way into every crevice of the weapon system. As Sarah began the disassembly process, her hands moved with unconscious familiarity, finding every component and connection point with the kind of muscle memory that came from thousands of hours of hands-on experience. She caught herself working too efficiently and deliberately slowed her pace, reminding herself that excellence could be just as dangerous as incompetence when you were trying to blend in.
"Damn, Martinez," commented Private First Class David Kim, a 19-year-old from the base motor pool who occasionally helped with equipment transport. "You stripped down that rifle like you've been doing it your whole life. Most civilians are nervous about even touching the trigger assembly." Sarah kept her attention focused on the bolt carrier group she was cleaning. "It's just machinery. Once you understand the engineering principles, it's not intimidating." She'd practiced that response for months, striking the right balance between competence and humility. Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes wandered over from his position near the equipment intake area, drawn by the smooth efficiency of Sarah's work. At 41, Hayes was a career maintainer who'd seen enough weapons pass through his facility to recognize when someone's skills exceeded their supposed background. He settled into a nearby chair and watched Sarah work with the quiet attention of someone conducting an informal assessment. "Interesting technique you've got there," Hayes observed, noting how Sarah's hands moved without hesitation or wasted motion. "Where'd you pick up that particular disassembly sequence? That's not the standard civilian training method." Sarah's hands paused for just a fraction of a second before resuming their work. "YouTube tutorials and practice. Amazing what you can learn online these days." It wasn't entirely a lie. She had watched YouTube videos, though that had been part of establishing her civilian cover rather than learning new skills. Hayes nodded thoughtfully but didn't immediately respond. Sarah could feel his continued observation as she worked, each step performed with the kind of automatic precision that was impossible to fake. She'd been careful for 11 months to work competently without being exceptional, but the weapons she was handling today were more complex than usual, and her professional instincts were overriding her caution. The morning progressed with Sarah falling into the rhythm that had become familiar over nearly a year of civilian life. Disassemble, clean, inspect, reassemble, function check, repeat. The work required focus and attention to detail, qualities that had served her well in her previous career, though here they were applied to much less consequential tasks. Still, there was satisfaction in doing good work, even if that work was far removed from the high-stakes operations that had once defined her existence.
Around mid-morning, Staff Sergeant Chen approached Sarah's station again, this time accompanied by a visitor Sarah didn't recognize. The woman wore the uniform of a major, with the kind of bearing that suggested she was accustomed to command responsibilities. Sarah continued working while keeping the major in her peripheral vision, noting the way she moved and observed the facility operations. "Martinez," Chen said, drawing Sarah's attention away from the rifle she was inspecting. "This is Major Patricia Lawson from the Base Training Command. She's conducting a routine assessment of our maintenance procedures." Sarah looked up and made brief eye contact with Major Lawson, noting the intelligence and calculation in the officer's gaze. "Ma'am," Sarah said politely, returning her attention to her work. "Carry on," Major Lawson replied, but Sarah could feel the major's attention lingering on her workstation. There was something about the way Lawson observed that made Sarah's instincts prickle with warning. This wasn't a routine assessment. This was an evaluation, though Sarah couldn't yet determine what was being evaluated or why. As the major and sergeant moved on to other areas of the facility, Sarah found herself thinking about the careful balance she'd maintained for 11 months. She'd built a life here that was ordinary, predictable, and safe. But as she worked through the complex weapon systems that had been assigned to her today, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed anonymity was about to face its most serious test yet. The collar of her coveralls shifted slightly as she leaned over her workbench, and Sarah unconsciously adjusted it back into position, ensuring that the small area of skin at the base of her neck remained covered. Some secrets were too dangerous to reveal, no matter how much time had passed or how safe civilian life seemed. But maintaining those secrets required constant vigilance, and Sarah was beginning to realize that 11 months of careful behavior might not be enough to hide who she really was from someone trained to look beneath the surface. 3 days after Major Lawson's visit, Sarah found herself assigned to a task that would test the boundaries of her carefully maintained facade. A shipment of damaged equipment had arrived from Joint Base Andrews, and among the standard rifles and sidearms was something that made her pulse quicken, a collection of specialized weapon systems that she recognized immediately but wasn't supposed to know existed.
"Special project today, Martinez," Staff Sergeant Chen announced, leading Sarah to a secure workstation she'd never used before. The area required an additional badge scan and was separated from the main floor by reinforced glass partitions. "We've got some high-end equipment that came back from a training exercise. The manufacturer's tech rep won't be available for 2 weeks, but the command wants these systems operational for an upcoming demonstration." Sarah surveyed the equipment spread across the specialized workbench. Among the items was an XM-25 airburst system, 2 prototype smart rifles with integrated targeting computers, and what appeared to be a next-generation sniper system that wasn't supposed to enter field testing for another year. Her trained eye immediately identified several potential issues, but acknowledging that knowledge would raise questions she couldn't answer. "What kind of demonstration?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral while her mind cataloged the tactical applications of the equipment before her. "VIP visit next month," Chen replied, consulting her tablet. "Some congressional delegation wants to see our advanced capabilities in action. Problem is, 3 of these systems malfunctioned during the exercise, and we can't afford to look incompetent in front of the oversight committee." Sarah nodded and began examining the first weapon system, a smart rifle that should have been capable of automatically adjusting for wind, distance, and target movement. The integrated computer display was dark, and she could see scorch marks around the electronic housing that suggested an electrical failure. Her hands moved over the system with practiced efficiency, identifying connection points and diagnostic interfaces that weren't covered in any civilian training manual. "You seem to know your way around that equipment," observed a new voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Captain Lisa Rodriguez, an intelligence officer she'd noticed around the base but never interacted with directly. Rodriguez had the kind of sharp attention that made Sarah's defensive instincts activate. "Just following the basic troubleshooting protocols," Sarah replied, though she realized her hands had been moving with more confidence than her words suggested. "Most electronic systems have similar failure patterns."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Captain Rodriguez stepped closer, studying Sarah's technique with obvious interest. "Similar failure patterns to what? Your background shows automotive repair experience, but this is military-grade integrated weapons technology. The troubleshooting approaches are completely different." Sarah felt the first real crack forming in her cover. She'd been so focused on the technical problem that she'd forgotten to maintain her civilian persona. "I meant electronic systems in general," she said, trying to backtrack. "Cars these days have pretty sophisticated computer systems too." "Do they?" Rodriguez pulled out her phone and made a note. "What kind of cars did you work on that had anything comparable to battlefield computer integration?" The question was a trap, and Sarah knew it. Any specific answer would be easily verifiable, but vague responses would only increase suspicion. She chose a middle path, mixing truth with misdirection. "I worked on some modified racing vehicles in Phoenix, high-performance systems with custom electronics for telemetry and engine management." Rodriguez nodded slowly but didn't look convinced. Racing vehicles. Interesting background for someone who ended up in weapons maintenance. She paused, studying Sarah's face. "Mind if I watch you work? I'm always curious about cross-disciplinary problem-solving approaches." Sarah had no choice but to agree, though having an intelligence officer observe her work was the last thing she wanted. As she continued examining the malfunctioning smart rifle, she forced herself to slow down, to appear to think through problems that she could solve instinctively. The effort was exhausting, like a concert pianist pretending to struggle with basic scales. The rifle's diagnostic system required a specific access sequence to reach the core programming interface. Sarah's fingers moved toward the correct combination before she caught herself and deliberately tried 2 incorrect approaches first. The delay felt artificial even to her, but it was better than demonstrating knowledge that should have taken years to acquire. "That's an interesting approach," Rodriguez commented as Sarah finally accessed the diagnostic menu. "Most people would have tried the manufacturer's standard sequence first. How did you know to bypass the primary interface?"
Sarah's mouth went dry. She'd made another mistake, relying on knowledge from her previous life without thinking how to explain it. "Lucky guess," she said weakly. "Sometimes when the obvious approach doesn't work, you have to try alternatives." "Lucky guess," Rodriguez repeated, making another note on her phone. "You seem to have a lot of those." As Sarah worked through the diagnostic sequence, she discovered that the weapon's failure was more complex than a simple electronic malfunction. The integrated targeting system had been damaged by what appeared to be an electromagnetic pulse. But the pattern of component failures suggested the damage had been caused by a very specific type of EMP device, one that was typically used by hostile forces to disable advanced weapon systems in the field. The realization sent a chill through Sarah's body. This wasn't equipment that had malfunctioned during a routine training exercise. These weapons had been exposed to enemy countermeasures, which meant they'd been used in actual combat operations. The question was whether the damage had occurred during authorized missions or if something more troubling was happening. "Find something interesting?" Rodriguez asked, noting Sarah's change in expression. Sarah forced her face back to neutral. "Just trying to understand the failure pattern. Looks like some kind of electrical surge damaged multiple subsystems simultaneously." What kind of electrical surge could cause that specific pattern of damage? The honest answer was an EMP weapon designed specifically to disable NATO standard smart rifle systems. But Sarah couldn't say that without revealing knowledge she wasn't supposed to possess. "Hard to say without more diagnostic equipment," she replied. "Could be a power supply failure that cascaded through the system." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, studying both Sarah and the damaged weapon. "You know, Martinez, your supervisor mentioned that you've been working here for almost a year. In that time, you've consistently produced excellent work, always on schedule, never had any safety incidents or security issues." "I try to do good work," Sarah said, carefully, unsure where this conversation was leading. "The thing is," Rodriguez continued, "excellent work from civilian contractors usually comes with a learning curve. People make mistakes while they're figuring out procedures, ask questions about equipment they haven't seen before, and need guidance on security protocols. But according to the records I've reviewed, you've never needed any of that. You started here and immediately worked at a level that typically takes months to achieve." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. "I'm a quick learner." "Maybe," Rodriguez said, "or maybe you already knew all this before you started working here." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Tell me, Martinez, what did you do during the gap in your employment history between 2019 and 2022? The question hit like a physical blow. Sarah's carefully constructed background showed steady employment in automotive repair, with only brief gaps that could be explained by normal job transitions. But Rodriguez had apparently dug deeper and found the 3-year period that Sarah thought she'd successfully obscured. "I was traveling," Sarah said, sticking to her prepared cover story. "Took some time off to see the country, did odd jobs here and there. Nothing formal enough to put on a resume." "Traveling for 3 years?" Rodriguez skeptically. "That's expensive for someone working automotive repair jobs. Where did you get the money for that kind of extended travel?" Sarah's mind raced through possible explanations. Any answer she gave would be subject to verification, and she couldn't afford to create lies that would unravel under investigation. "I saved up money and lived cheaply. Camping, staying in hostels, that kind of thing." Rodriguez made another note, then gestured toward the damaged smart rifle. "Well, while you were camping and staying in hostels, did you happen to encounter any electromagnetic pulse weapons or advanced military countermeasures? Because that's what caused the damage to this system." The observation was delivered casually, but Sarah recognized it as a test. Rodriguez knew exactly what had damaged the weapon and was watching to see how Sarah would react to that information. Any civilian contractor should have been surprised or confused by the mention of EMP weapons. Instead, Sarah felt her tactical training kick in as she considered the implications of enemy weapons being used against American forces. "I wouldn't know anything about that," Sarah said, though her voice carried less conviction than she'd intended. "No, I suppose you wouldn't," Rodriguez agreed. After all, knowledge of enemy EMP capabilities and their specific effects on NATO weapons systems isn't something you'd pick up during automotive repair training or camping trips. The silence stretched between them as Sarah continued working on the damaged rifle, acutely aware that every movement was being scrutinized for signs of knowledge she shouldn't possess. Rodriguez wasn't just casually observing anymore. She was conducting an investigation, and Sarah was the primary subject. "You know what's really interesting?" Rodriguez said suddenly. "The damage pattern on this rifle matches reports from a classified operation that took place in Eastern Europe 18 months ago. Small unit engagement where advanced weapon systems were targeted by sophisticated enemy countermeasures." Sarah's hands stilled completely for a moment before she forced herself to continue working. Rodriguez was fishing for information, but the specificity of her knowledge suggested she already had suspicions about Sarah's background. The question was how much she actually knew versus how much she was guessing. "That sounds above my clearance level," Sarah said. "Oh, it definitely is," Rodriguez agreed. "Which makes me wonder how you're able to identify the specific failure patterns so accurately. Most civilian contractors would see burned electronics and assume a simple power failure, but you immediately recognize this as something more sophisticated." Sarah realized she'd walked into another trap. Her analysis of the weapon damage had been too precise, too immediate. A civilian contractor might eventually reach the same conclusions, but it would take hours of investigation and consultation with technical manuals. Sarah had recognized the EMP signature within minutes of examining the system. "I'm just good with electronics," Sarah said, though the excuse sounded weak even to her. Rodriguez smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Yes, you are. Remarkably good. Almost like you've seen this kind of damage before, under operational conditions." The accusation hung in the air between them, unspoken but clearly implied. Sarah forced herself to focus on the weapon repair, though her mind was racing through contingency plans. Her cover was compromised, possibly beyond repair, but she wasn't sure yet how much Rodriguez actually knew versus suspected. "Captain Rodriguez," Staff Sergeant Chen's voice interrupted the tense conversation. "Major Lawson wants to see you in the command office. Something about the equipment assessment report." Rodriguez glanced at her watch, then back at Sarah. "We'll continue this conversation later, Martinez. I have some more questions about your background that I think you'll find interesting to discuss." As Rodriguez walked away, Sarah allowed herself to exhale slowly. The first real cracks in her cover had become visible, and she could feel the foundation of her civilian life beginning to shift beneath her feet. The question now was whether she could repair the damage before it spread too far, or if 11 months of careful anonymity were about to come to an end. She returned her attention to the damaged smart rifle, but her hands were no longer quite as steady as they'd been that morning. Change was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. The next morning brought changes that made Sarah's skin crawl with apprehension. Her usual workstation in the back corner had been relocated to the center of the main floor, directly under the brightest fluorescent lights and within clear view of every supervisor, officer, and visitor who entered the facility. When she asked Jennifer Walsh about the sudden rearrangement, the older woman's response was carefully neutral. "New efficiency initiative," Walsh said, not quite meeting Sarah's eyes. "Something about optimizing workflow patterns and improving oversight of contractor operations." Sarah understood the real message. She was being watched, and whoever had ordered the change wanted her to know it. As she settled into her new, highly visible position, she noticed that Technical Sergeant Hayes had also been moved to a workstation that provided an unobstructed view of her activities. The message was clear. Her every movement would be monitored and evaluated. The morning's work assignment confirmed her suspicions. Instead of the varied mix of weapons and equipment she normally handled, Sarah found herself assigned exclusively to basic maintenance tasks on standard-issue M4 rifles. No complex systems, no challenging repairs, nothing that would require her to demonstrate the kind of advanced knowledge that had gotten her into trouble the previous day. Keeping things simple today, Staff Sergeant Chen announced as she delivered the work orders. Her tone was professionally neutral, but Sarah caught the underlying tension. Thought you might appreciate some straightforward work after yesterday's challenges. Sarah accepted the clipboard without comment, but her mind was already working through the implications. They were testing her, seeing how she would react to being deliberately limited in her duties. Any complaint or sign of frustration would be interpreted as evidence that she was accustomed to more complex work than her background suggested. As she began disassembling her first rifle of the day, Sarah forced herself to work at a deliberately moderate pace. Every instinct screamed at her to complete the tasks efficiently, but efficiency had become her enemy. She needed to appear competent but not expert. It was a psychological tightrope that required constant vigilance. "Quality control inspection," announced a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Master Sergeant Angela Foster, the facility's senior non-commissioned officer. Foster was a 20-year veteran with the kind of sharp attention to detail that had made her legendary throughout the maintenance community. Her presence meant this was more than a routine check. "Morning, Sergeant," Sarah said, continuing her work while Foster positioned herself for optimal observation. "Morning, Martinez. Heard you had some interesting interactions yesterday with Captain Rodriguez." Foster's tone was conversational, but Sarah recognized the probing nature of the comment. "She seemed quite impressed with your technical knowledge." Sarah kept her expression neutral while her mind processed the implications. Foster's comments suggested that Rodriguez had filed some kind of report, and that report had been significant to warrant attention from the facility's senior leadership. "Just tried to be helpful with the equipment assessment." Foster nodded thoughtfully while examining Sarah's work with meticulous attention. "Helpful is good, but sometimes being too helpful can raise questions about where that helpfulness comes from." She picked up the rifle Sarah had just finished and began a detailed inspection. "This is exceptional work, clean, properly lubricated, all functions operating smoothly, almost like it was serviced by someone with extensive field experience."
The observation was delivered casually, but Sarah felt the weight of accusation behind it. Foster had identified something in her work that betrayed professional military training, probably techniques or attention to details that civilian contractors wouldn't know to look for. "I just try to be thorough," Sarah replied, echoing the response she'd practiced for months. "Thorough is one thing," Foster said, continuing her inspection, "but this level of attention to specific components, the way you've addressed potential failure points that aren't covered in civilian training manuals, that suggests knowledge that comes from understanding how these weapons perform under combat conditions." Sarah felt her carefully constructed foundation cracking further. Foster was identifying specific elements of her work that betrayed military experience, and there was no civilian explanation that would satisfy that level of scrutiny. "I read a lot of technical documentation." "Technical documentation," Foster repeated, making notes on her clipboard. "Tell me, Martinez, what technical documentation covers the specific maintenance requirements for weapons that have been exposed to desert sandstorms?" The question was a trap, and Sarah knew it. The rifle she'd just serviced had indeed been exposed to desert conditions, and she'd automatically performed specialized cleaning procedures that were only covered in classified military manuals. A civilian contractor might eventually figure out the proper approach through trial and error, but Sarah had immediately known exactly what needed to be done. "I noticed the sand particulate patterns and adjusted my cleaning approach accordingly," Sarah said, trying to sound like she was explaining logical problem-solving rather than revealing specialized training. Foster made another note, then looked directly at Sarah with the kind of penetrating stare that seemed to see through carefully constructed facades. "The cleaning approach you used is specifically designed for weapons that have been used in Middle Eastern theater operations. It addresses particular challenges with fine sand particulates that can cause microabrasions in specific components. That's not general technical knowledge, that's operational experience." Before Sarah could respond, the facility's main door opened to admit Major Patricia Lawson, accompanied by two people Sarah didn't recognize. One was a woman in civilian clothes who had the unmistakable bearing of federal law enforcement, and the other was a man in Army dress uniform whose rank insignia identified him as a lieutenant colonel. "All personnel continue normal operations,"
Staff Sergeant Chen announced, but there was obvious tension in her voice. Major Lawson is conducting an expanded facility assessment. Sarah tried to focus on her work, but she was acutely aware of the group's progress across the facility floor. They weren't conducting a general inspection. They were moving with purpose toward specific areas, and their attention seemed to be focused on personnel rather than equipment. When they paused at Technical Sergeant Hayes' station for an extended conversation, Sarah caught fragments of discussion that made her stomach drop. Background inconsistencies, elevated skill demonstration, potential security implications. The conversation was too quiet to follow completely, but the key words were enough to confirm Sarah's worst fears. This wasn't just local suspicion anymore. Federal investigators were involved, and they were asking questions about her background that would inevitably lead to uncomfortable truths. Martinez, Master Sergeant Foster's voice drew her attention back to the immediate situation. Major Lawson would like to speak with you. The walk across the facility floor felt like the longest journey of Sarah's life. Every step took her closer to a conversation that could destroy the civilian identity she'd spent 11 months building. By the time she reached the group, Sarah had run through dozens of scenarios, none of which ended well for her continued anonymity. "Miss Martinez," Major Lawson said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting direct answers to difficult questions. "I'd like you to meet Special Agent Rebecca Torres from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service and Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell from Army Criminal Investigation Command." Sarah nodded politely, though her mind was racing through the implications of having both federal investigators and Army CID involved in whatever was happening. "Ma'am, sir." "Miss Martinez," Agent Torres began, consulting a tablet computer, "we've been reviewing your employment record and background information. There are some discrepancies that we'd like to clarify." Sarah felt the trap closing around her, but she maintained her composed exterior. "What kind of discrepancies?" Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, his expression professionally neutral but intense. "Your employment history shows a 3-year gap between 2019 and 2022. When questioned about this period, you indicated you were traveling. However, our preliminary investigation has been unable to locate any evidence of the activities you described." Sarah's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "I lived pretty simply during that time, didn't leave much of a paper trail." "No paper trail," Agent Torres repeated, making notes on her tablet. "No credit card records, no bank transactions, no hotel registrations, no vehicle registrations, no tax filings. For 3 years, Sarah Martinez effectively disappeared from all official records." The statement hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah realized they'd conducted a much more thorough investigation than she'd anticipated, and her carefully prepared cover story was already showing major gaps under federal scrutiny. "I used cash mostly," Sarah said, though she could hear the weakness in her own voice. "Stayed with friends, worked odd jobs that didn't require formal documentation." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell pulled out a photograph and showed it to Sarah. It was a surveillance image from a gas station, grainy but clearly showing her face. The interesting thing is that the facial recognition software initially flagged it as a potential match for someone else entirely, someone who's supposed to be dead.
Sarah's blood ran cold. The photograph was from her journey to Nevada when she'd been establishing her civilian identity, but the mention of facial recognition and a dead person meant they were much closer to the truth than she'd realized. "I don't understand," Sarah said, though her mind was already working through escape routes and contingency plans. "The facial recognition system initially identified you as Sergeant First Class Maria Santos," Agent Torres continued, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. "Maria Santos was a special operations soldier who was killed in action during a classified mission in Syria 3 years ago." Sarah felt the last foundations of her cover crumbling beneath her feet. They knew, maybe not everything, but enough to connect her current identity to her previous life. The question now was how much they could prove, and whether she could still salvage some semblance of her civilian existence. "That's impossible," Sarah said, putting genuine confusion into her voice. "I've never been in the military." Major Lawson stepped closer, studying Sarah's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle.
The facial recognition match was initially dismissed as a false positive because Maria Santos is officially dead. But Captain Rodriguez's observations about your technical knowledge, combined with Master Sergeant Foster's assessment of your work quality, suggest that perhaps the initial identification deserves a second look. Sarah remained silent, knowing that anything she said would only provide more evidence for their investigation. The smart play was to maintain her cover and hope they couldn't prove their suspicions, but she could see the calculation in their eyes. They weren't just fishing for information anymore. They had specific theories they were testing. "Miss Martinez," Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell said, his tone becoming more formal, "we're going to need you to come with us for a more detailed interview. There are questions about your background that require clarification in a secure environment." Sarah looked around the facility, seeing her co-workers watching with obvious curiosity and concern. Jennifer Walsh looked worried, while Technical Sergeant Hayes appeared grimly satisfied, as if his suspicions were finally being validated. The careful normalcy she'd built over 11 months was disintegrating in real time. "Am I under arrest?" Sarah asked. "Not at this time," Agent Torres replied, "but we do need to resolve these background discrepancies before you can continue working in a position that provides access to sensitive military equipment." Sarah nodded, knowing she had no choice. As she gathered her personal items from her workstation, she caught sight of her reflection in the polished surface of a cleaning tool. For just a moment, she saw not Sarah Martinez, the civilian contractor, but the person she used to be, the soldier who'd never officially existed and was supposed to be dead. The interview would either confirm her death or resurrect her past. Either way, her life was about to change dramatically. The secure interview room in the base's Criminal Investigation Division building was exactly what Sarah had expected. Sterile white walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and chairs designed for discomfort rather than extended conversation. She'd been sitting alone for 20 minutes, long enough for the investigators to review whatever files they'd assembled on her background, when the door finally opened. Agent Torres entered first, followed by Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell and a third person Sarah hadn't seen before. A woman in civilian clothes whose bearings suggested senior federal authority. The newcomer carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from operating at the highest levels of government intelligence work. "Miss Martinez," Agent Torres began, settling into the chair across from Sarah, "I'd like you to meet Deputy Director Catherine Walsh from the Defense Intelligence Agency. She's joined our investigation due to some classified aspects of your background that have recently come to light." Sarah felt her stomach drop. DIA involvement meant they'd connected her not just to military service, but to intelligence operations that fell under the highest levels of classification. Deputy Director Walsh studied Sarah with the kind of penetrating attention that suggested she already knew far more than she was letting on. "Miss Martinez," Walsh said, her voice carrying authority that seemed to fill the small room, or should I say, Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, formerly of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. They knew everything, not just that she'd been in the military, but her exact unit assignment and the classified operations that weren't supposed to exist in any official records. Her carefully constructed civilian identity crumbled completely at that moment. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, though the response sounded hollow even to her. Walsh opened a classified folder and spread several photographs across the table. Sarah recognized them immediately. Mission photos from Syria, Afghanistan, and other locations where she'd operated under deep cover. In each image, her face had been digitally obscured, but other identifying details were clearly visible. These photographs were taken during Operation Silent Thunder, a classified counter-terrorism mission in eastern Syria. The soldier in these images is identified in classified records as Maria Santos, a Delta Force operative specializing in high-value target extraction and deep reconnaissance operations. Sarah remained silent, knowing that any response would only confirm what they already seemed to know. According to official records, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell added, consulting his own files, Maria Santos was killed in action during a mission in Syria 3 years ago. Walsh leaned forward, her attention focused entirely on Sarah. The problem is that Maria Santos didn't die in Syria. She was extracted under circumstances that required her complete disappearance from all official records. Given a new identity and allowed to fade into civilian life as a reward for her service and to protect her from retaliation by hostile forces. Sarah felt the last of her defenses crumbling. They knew not just her real identity, but the classified circumstances surrounding her transition to civilian life. The question now was what they intended to do with that knowledge. Before anyone could speak further, Agent Torres's radio crackled to life with an urgent transmission. All units, we have a code red security alert in Sector 12. Multiple casualties reported, possible hostile infiltration in progress. All available personnel report to emergency stations immediately.
The three investigators exchanged glances, clearly torn between continuing their interrogation and responding to what sounded like a major security incident. Sarah's trained ear caught details in the radio chatter that made her pulse quicken, references to coordinated attacks, advanced weapons, and tactical movements that suggested this wasn't a training accident or random violence. Multiple entry points breached, came another transmission. Unknown number of hostiles using military-grade equipment. The base commander is requesting immediate tactical response from all available assets. Deputy Director Walsh stood up, speaking quickly into her secure phone. Her conversation was brief but intense, and when she finished, her expression had changed from investigative focus to operational urgency. The situation is more serious than the initial reports indicated, Walsh announced. We have what appears to be a coordinated attack on the base's classified research facility. The attackers are using advanced tactics and equipment that suggest professional military training. Sarah's mind immediately shifted into tactical analysis mode. A coordinated attack on a secure military installation required extensive planning, inside knowledge, and capabilities that suggested state-sponsored terrorism or rogue military operators. The kind of threat that she'd been specifically trained to counter during her years with Delta Force. How many casualties? Sarah asked before she could stop herself. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell looked surprised by her immediate shift to tactical thinking. Initial reports indicate 6 wounded, 2 critical, but the situation is still developing. Agent Torres's radio continued crackling with updates that painted an increasingly dire picture. Hostiles have secured the main research building and are holding an unknown number of personnel hostage. They're demanding access to classified materials and threatening to execute hostages if their demands aren't met. Sarah felt her operational instincts overriding every other consideration. People were in danger, and the situation required exactly the kind of specialized intervention that had once been her profession. But she was supposed to be a dead soldier, and revealing her true capabilities would destroy any remaining chance of maintaining her civilian life. What kind of classified materials are they after? Sarah asked, her voice taking on the crisp efficiency of someone trained for crisis response. Walsh hesitated, clearly debating how much classified information to share. Advanced weapons research, prototype systems that aren't supposed to exist in any public records. Sarah's blood ran cold. She'd seen some of those prototype systems during her work in the weapons maintenance facility. And if hostile forces gain access to that technology, the implications for national security would be catastrophic. Base Tactical Response Team is engaging now, came another radio transmission. Taking heavy fire from entrenched positions. Hostiles appear to have professional military training and are using coordinated defensive tactics. Sarah stood up abruptly, her decision made despite the consequences. You need to let me help. The 3 investigators stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Agent Torres was the first to respond. Ms. Martinez, you're a civilian contractor under investigation for background discrepancies. You can't possibly.
I can resolve this situation with minimal additional casualties, Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd handled similar crises multiple times. But only if you stop treating me like a suspect and start using me as an asset. Walsh studied Sarah with new intensity. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah moved to the whiteboard mounted on the interview room wall and began sketching a layout of the base's classified research facility from memory. Her knowledge of the building's internal structure, security systems, and potential vulnerabilities was immediately obvious to everyone in the room. The research facility has 3 primary access points and 2 emergency exits, Sarah explained, her briefing tone crisp and professional. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell stepped closer to examine Sarah's sketch. How do you know the internal layout of a classified facility? Because I helped design the security protocols during my last mission rotation, Sarah replied, abandoning any pretense of civilian ignorance. That facility houses technology that I've personally secured from hostile forces in 3 different theaters of operation. Walsh pulled out her secure phone and spoke rapidly to someone on the other end. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds, but when she finished, her entire demeanor had changed. Maria Santos, she said, using Sarah's real name for the first time. I just spoke with your former commanding officer. He confirms that you have extensive experience with exactly this type of situation and that your tactical expertise could be critical for resolving the crisis. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Her true identity was now completely exposed, but for the first time in 3 years, she was being asked to use her real skills for their intended purpose. What do you need? Walsh asked. Sarah consulted her watch, calculating tactical timelines. Access to tactical gear, current intelligence on hostile positions, and authorization to enter the facility. Every minute we spend discussing my background is time those hostages don't have. Agent Torres looked conflicted. Even if everything you're saying is true, you've been out of operational status for 3 years. Your skills might not be current enough for a situation this complex. Sarah's expression hardened with the kind of cold determination that had once made her legendary among special operations communities. Agent Torres, I've extracted hostages from facilities designed by people who were specifically trying to kill me. This situation is exactly what I was trained for, and those people in there are running out of time. Walsh made another quick phone call, then turned back to Sarah. You have authorization from the highest levels of command, but understand that once you enter that facility, Maria Santos officially exists again. Your civilian life as Sarah Martinez is over. Sarah looked toward the window that faced the direction of the research facility, where smoke was now visible rising from multiple buildings. People were dying while she stood in an interview room debating her identity. It was over the moment I walked into that weapons facility 11 months ago, Sarah said quietly. I just didn't want to admit it. As alarms continued sounding across the base and radio chatter filled the air with reports of escalating violence, Sarah realized that her carefully constructed peaceful life had been an illusion. She'd never really stopped being Maria Santos. She'd just been pretending that Sarah Martinez could exist in a world where people like her former self weren't necessary. Now it was time to stop pretending and remember who she really was. 20 minutes later, Maria Santos stood in the base's Tactical Operations Center, no longer wearing the Navy coveralls of a civilian contractor, but instead dressed in full combat gear that felt like a second skin after 3 years of civilian life. The transformation was complete. Gone was the quiet maintenance worker who'd spent 11 months trying to blend into the background, replaced by the operator who'd once been considered one of Delta Force's most effective assets. The Tactical Operations Center buzzed with controlled chaos as officers coordinated the response to what had become a full-scale crisis. Large screens displayed real-time surveillance feeds from around the research facility, showing armed figures in tactical gear maintaining defensive positions while base security forces remained pinned down by accurate sniper fire. Situation update, announced Colonel Sarah Hendricks, the base commander, as Maria approached the central command table. We have confirmed hostile control of the main research building with an estimated 12 to 15 personnel inside, including scientists, security guards, and maintenance staff. The attackers are demanding access to Project Blackwater files and threatening to execute hostages every 30 minutes until their demands are met. Maria studied the tactical displays, her trained eye immediately identifying the professional nature of the attack. The hostile positions were expertly chosen to maximize defensive advantages while minimizing exposure to counterattack. This wasn't the work of amateur terrorists. These were operators with military training comparable to her own. "What's Project Blackwater?" Maria asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Deputy Director Walsh stepped forward, her expression grim. "Next-generation weapon systems that incorporate AI-assisted targeting and autonomous engagement capabilities. The technology is years ahead of anything currently deployed, and, in the wrong hands, it could shift the balance of power in multiple ongoing conflicts." Maria nodded, understanding the strategic implications. The attackers weren't just after advanced weapons, they were seeking technology that could fundamentally change modern warfare. The kind of breakthrough that foreign powers or terrorist organizations would kill for. "What's the tactical team's assessment?" Maria asked, gesturing toward the screen showing the standoff. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell pulled up a detailed briefing on his tablet. The first attempt at entry was repelled with 2 casualties. The hostiles have positioned marksmen to cover all conventional approach routes, and they're using advanced communication equipment to coordinate their defensive positions in real time. Maria examined the surveillance feeds more closely, noting details that the base tactical team might have missed. They're not just defending randomly. Look at the positioning. They've created overlapping fields of fire that force any approaching force into predetermined kill zones. This is textbook asymmetric defense designed to maximize casualties among conventional assault forces. Colonel Hendricks leaned over the command table. "Our tactical team leader estimates it would take a full company assault to breach their positions, with significant casualties on both sides. The problem is that kind of operation would likely result in hostage deaths." "How much time do we have before their next deadline?" Maria asked, checking the digital countdown clock that had been set up on one of the displays. 18 minutes, Agent Torres replied. "They've already executed 1 hostage to demonstrate they're serious about their threats." Maria felt the familiar cold calculation settle over her as she shifted into full operational mode. The situation required exactly the kind of precision intervention that had made her reputation in the special operations community. High risk, minimal backup, with success measured in lives saved rather than enemy casualties. "I need real-time intelligence on internal layouts, current hostile positions, and any available technical specifications on their equipment," Maria said, her voice taking on the crisp authority of someone accustomed to commanding life-and-death operations. Walsh gestured to an intelligence analyst who immediately began pulling up classified files on multiple screens. "We have thermal imaging showing at least 6 heat signals in defensive positions and approximately 8 more in the central laboratory area where the hostages are being held." Maria studied the thermal displays, noting movement patterns that reveal the attackers' tactical discipline. They're maintaining professional fire team spacing and rotation schedules. This isn't improvised. They've trained for this specific scenario. "How is that possible?" Colonel Hendricks asked. "The research facility's layout and security protocols are highly classified." Maria's expression darkened as she considered the implications. Someone provided them with detailed intelligence. This operation required months of planning and access to information that should only be available to people with the highest security clearances. The realization sent a chill through the command center. They weren't just dealing with external attackers. There's likely a traitor within the military or intelligence community who had enabled this operation. "Agent Torres," Walsh said sharply, "initiate a security lockdown of all personnel with access to Project Blackwater files. I want background checks and current location verification for everyone who's had contact with this facility in the past 6 months." As the investigation began in parallel with the tactical response, Maria continued analyzing the situation through the lens of her operational experience. Something about the attacker's methodology seemed familiar, triggering memories of adversaries she'd encountered during her years of classified missions. Deputy Director Walsh, Maria said slowly, I need to see any intelligence reports on suspected foreign operative activity in this region over the past year. Walsh hesitated. That information is compartmentalized above your current clearance level.
My current clearance level is whatever it needs to be to resolve this crisis, Maria replied firmly. And I think I might recognize the tactical signature of whoever planned this operation. After a brief secure phone call, Walsh authorized access to the intelligence files. As Maria reviewed the reports, her suspicions were confirmed. The operational methodology matched patterns she'd observed during her final mission in Eastern Europe, the mission that had supposedly resulted in her death. This is impossible, Maria muttered, studying surveillance photos from 3 different intelligence reports. These tactical patterns match operations conducted by Viktor Kozlov's cell. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell looked up from his tactical displays. Who is Viktor Kozlov? Maria's jaw tightened as she recalled her last encounter with the Russian operative. Former Spetsnaz officer turned freelance military contractor. Specializes in high-value theft operations targeting advanced military technology. I thought he was dead. You thought he was dead because you killed him, Walsh said quietly, having apparently read Maria's classified mission reports. No, Maria corrected, her voice carrying the weight of unfinished business. I killed his team and destroyed his operation, but Kozlov himself escaped. He swore he'd find a way to target American military assets in retaliation. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with disturbing clarity. This wasn't just a random attack on the research facility. It was personal revenge combined with strategic objectives. Kozlov had spent 3 years planning an operation that would both steal critical technology and draw out the operator who had destroyed his previous mission. He knows I'm here, Maria realized aloud. This entire operation is designed to force me into a direct confrontation. Colonel Hendricks studied the tactical displays with new understanding. You're saying this is a trap specifically targeting you? Partially, Maria replied, but it's also a legitimate theft operation. Kozlov is smart enough to combine personal revenge with profitable objectives. He gets the technology he came for and a chance to settle old scores. The countdown clock showed 12 minutes remaining until the next execution deadline. In the surveillance feeds, Maria could see increased movement among the attackers as they prepared to carry out their threat. Every minute spent on analysis was time the hostages didn't have. I'm going in, Maria announced, checking her tactical gear one final time. Alone? Agent Torres asked incredulously. Against a force of 15 trained operatives in a fortified position? Maria looked around the command center at the faces staring back at her. Military officers, intelligence analysts, and federal agents who were accustomed to overwhelming force and extensive backup support. They didn't understand that sometimes the most effective approach was the one that no one expected. Kozlov is expecting a conventional assault. He's positioned his people to repel a large force using standard military tactics. What he's not expecting is a single operator using infiltration techniques he's never encountered. Walsh stepped forward, her expression showing both admiration and concern. Maria, even if you successfully infiltrate the facility, you'll be facing odds of 15 to 1 against professionally trained opponents. That's not a tactical operation, that's a suicide mission. Maria touched the area of her neck where her collar had always carefully concealed the small tattoo that marked her as a member of one of the military's most classified units. For 11 months, she'd hidden that mark and everything it represented, pretending that Sarah Martinez could exist in a world where people like Viktor Kozlov operate with impunity. But some things can't be hidden forever. She moved toward the exit that would take her to the staging area where her infiltration equipment was being prepared. Kozlov made one critical mistake in his planning. He assumed that Maria Psychos was really dead. But I'm not dead. I was just sleeping.
As alarms continued sounding across the base and the countdown clock ticked toward another execution, Maria Santos fully embraced the identity she'd tried to leave behind. The quiet maintenance worker who'd spent 11 months cleaning weapons was gone forever, replaced by the operator who'd once been considered one of the military's most lethal assets. The revelation was complete, but the most dangerous part of her journey was just beginning. In less than 10 minutes, she would enter a facility controlled by the one enemy who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of, and who had spent 3 years planning for this exact confrontation. Colonel Hendrix's voice followed her toward the exit. "Santos, what's your assessment of success probability?" Maria paused at the doorway, considering the question with the cold calculation that had kept her alive through dozens of impossible missions. "Success isn't about probability, Colonel. It's about commitment to bringing people home alive, regardless of the odds." As she disappeared into the staging area to prepare for infiltration, the command center fell silent except for the steady ticking of the countdown clock. In 8 minutes, Maria Santos would either save 15 hostages and secure critical national security assets, or she would die in the attempt. For the first time in 3 years, she felt completely certain about who she was and what she needed to do. The infiltration began through a maintenance tunnel that Maria remembered from her security assessment 3 years earlier, a route that wouldn't appear on any current facility blueprints because it had been sealed after her recommendations. But sealed didn't mean eliminated, and Maria's photographic memory of structural layouts gave her access that Kozlov's intelligence hadn't accounted for. Moving through the narrow service tunnel, Maria could hear the muffled sounds of the hostage situation above, occasional shouted commands in accented English, and the nervous voices of terrified civilians. Her thermal imaging device showed heat signatures distributed exactly as she'd predicted. 6 operators in defensive positions around the facility perimeter, with the remaining forces concentrated in the central laboratory where the hostages were being held. The tunnel emerged in a utility room that provided access to the building's environmental systems. Maria paused to check her equipment one final time. Suppressed sidearm, tactical knife, electronic countermeasures, and most importantly, the specialized communication device that would allow her to coordinate with the command center while maintaining operational silence. "Santos to command," she whispered into her throat microphone. "I'm inside the facility, beginning systematic neutralization of perimeter guards." Walsh's voice crackled softly in her earpiece. "Copy that. Thermal imaging shows no change in hostile positions. You have 4 minutes until the next execution deadline." 4 minutes to eliminate 6 professionally trained operatives without alerting the main force. Under normal circumstances, Maria would have considered the timeline impossible. But these weren't normal circumstances. They were exactly the kind of impossible odds that had made her legendary in the special operations community. The first guard was positioned in an office overlooking the main entrance, providing overwatch for any conventional assault. Maria approached through the ventilation system, using air ducts that Kozlov's team hadn't thought to secure. The operator was focused entirely on external threats, never considering that danger might come from above. Maria dropped silently behind him, her tactical knife finding the precise spot that would ensure instant unconsciousness without permanent injury. She wasn't here to kill unless absolutely necessary. Her mission was hostage rescue, not revenge, regardless of her personal history with Kozlov. "Perimeter Guard 1 neutralized," she reported softly, moving toward the next position. The second guard presented a more complex challenge. Positioned in a stairwell with clear sightlines in multiple directions, he couldn't be approached through stealth alone. Maria activated one of her electronic countermeasures, causing a brief power fluctuation that darkened the stairwell for exactly 3 seconds. It was enough time to close the distance and neutralize the threat before he could sound an alarm. Perimeter Guard 2 down, moving to interior positions. As Maria worked her way through the facility, she could hear increasingly agitated radio chatter from the remaining hostiles. They weren't aware that their perimeter was being systematically dismantled, but they could sense that something had changed in the tactical situation. The third and fourth guards were positioned together in the facility's main corridor, covering the primary approach route to the laboratory. Maria observed them through a security camera feed she'd hacked using equipment that technically didn't exist in any official inventory. Their positioning was professional but predictable, exactly what she'd expect from operators trained in conventional tactics. Using a distraction device that created the sound of breaking glass from the opposite end of the building, Maria drew one guard away from his position. The remaining operator found himself facing a threat he hadn't been trained to counter, an enemy who knew the facility better than he did, and who'd been specifically trained to operate against superior numbers. 4 perimeter guards were neutralized, 2 remaining exterior positions. Maria's earpiece crackled with an update from the command center. "Santos, we're monitoring hostile communications. They're becoming aware that something is wrong. Kozlov is demanding status reports from his perimeter teams." That confirmed what Maria had already suspected. Kozlov was personally commanding the operation from inside the laboratory. He'd positioned himself where he could directly oversee both the hostages and the stolen technology, but that also meant he'd be her final target in an increasingly complex tactical puzzle. The fifth guard was positioned in the facility's security office, monitoring surveillance feeds that should have shown him exactly what was happening to his teammates. But Maria had been systematically disabling cameras as she moved through the building, creating blind spots that made her invisible to electronic surveillance, while making the guard increasingly paranoid about system malfunctions. When she finally confronted him, he was so focused on trying to restore camera feeds that he never saw her coming. Like the others, he was neutralized with minimal force and secured where he couldn't interfere with the ongoing operation. 5 down, 1 perimeter guard remaining. The final exterior position was the most challenging. A sniper positioned on the facility's roof with a clear view of all conventional approach routes. Maria couldn't reach him through internal building access, which meant she'd have to expose herself to external observation while climbing to his position. Using her knowledge of the base's architectural features, Maria accessed the roof through a maintenance ladder that put her behind the sniper's position. He was completely focused on potential threats from ground level, never considering that an enemy might approach from his own building. All perimeter positions neutralized, ready to proceed to the primary objective. Walsh's voice carried new urgency. "Santos, you have less than 90 seconds before the execution deadline. Kozlov is demanding to speak directly with base command, and he specifically mentioned that he knows you're in the building." Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Kozlov knowing she was there meant either his intelligence was better than she'd credited, or he'd planned for this contingency from the beginning. Either possibility suggested that her infiltration had been anticipated, which meant the main assault would be far more dangerous than she'd calculated. Understood. Beginning final approach to the laboratory. Maria made her way back into the building through a skylight that accessed the upper level of the laboratory complex. Through the reinforced glass, she could see the hostages, 12 civilians in lab coats and maintenance uniforms, bound and seated against one wall, while 3 armed figures maintained guard positions around them. At the center of the laboratory, surrounded by sophisticated computer equipment and what appeared to be prototype weapon systems, stood a figure Maria recognized immediately despite 3 years of separation. Viktor Kozlov looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, lean, with the kind of controlled intensity that marked professional killers. He was speaking into a radio, presumably coordinating with his now silent perimeter teams. "American Command," Kozlov's accented voice carried clearly through the glass. "I know you can hear me. Your response time has been most disappointing. Perhaps the death of another hostage will motivate better cooperation." Maria watched as Kozlov gestured to one of his men, who moved toward the hostages with obvious intent. She had perhaps 30 seconds before another innocent person died, and her position didn't allow for a shot that wouldn't endanger the civilians.
"Santos to command," she whispered urgently. "I need a distraction.
something that will draw hostile attention away from the hostages for exactly 10 seconds. What kind of distraction? Walsh responded. Emergency lighting failure, building alarm, anything that creates confusion without suggesting tactical assault. 15 seconds later, the laboratory's lights flickered and died, replaced by the strobing red illumination of emergency systems. In the confusion that followed, Mariah crashed through the skylight, using the noise and chaos to mask her entry while the hostiles struggled to adapt to the sudden change in conditions. Maria Santos. Kozlov's voice cut through the darkness, calm and unsurprised. I was wondering when you would finally reveal yourself. Emergency lighting cast wild shadows across the laboratory as Mariah found cover behind a bank of computer equipment. Around the room, she could see Kozlov's remaining men adjusting their positions, but their movements were professional and coordinated rather than panicked. They'd been expecting this confrontation. "Victor," Mariah called out, assessing angles and distances while keeping her voice conversational. "Still stealing technology you're too incompetent to develop yourself?" Kozlov's laugh echoed through the darkened laboratory. "Still pretending to be the righteous soldier when you're nothing more than a government assassin? Tell me, Maria, how many people have you killed in the name of American democracy?" "Fewer than deserved it," Mariah replied, noting that 2 of Kozlov's men were moving to flank her position. "And all of them were people like you, professionals who knew the risks when they chose their profession. Unlike these innocent civilians," Kozlov said, gesturing toward the hostages. "They have no part in our conflict, yet they will pay the price for your government's refusal to cooperate." Maria could see that Kozlov still had one man positioned directly behind the hostages, weapon ready to carry out executions if the tactical situation deteriorated further. Any direct assault would likely result in civilian casualties, but allowing the standoff to continue guaranteed that people would die. "What do you want, Victor?" Maria asked, though she already knew the answer. "Justice," Kozlov replied. 3 years ago, you destroyed my operation and killed my team. Tonight, you will experience the same loss. Your team knew the risks when they signed up for illegal weapons trafficking," Maria said, using her voice to mask the sound of her movement toward a better position. "These people are innocent civilians." "Innocent?" Kozlov's voice carried genuine anger now. "They develop weapons that kill my countrymen, weapons that maintain American military superiority through technological advantage rather than courage or skill." Maria realized that Kozlov's motivation was more complex than simple revenge or profit. In his mind, he was conducting a legitimate military operation against strategic targets, which made him far more dangerous than a common criminal. People fighting for ideological reasons were willing to accept casualties that professionals might avoid. "So, what's your endgame?" Maria asked, continuing to maneuver while keeping Kozlov talking. "You steal the technology, execute the hostages, and then what? You've accomplished nothing except proving that terrorists can temporarily disrupt American operations. I prove that America's most elite soldiers can be defeated by superior planning and commitment," Kozlov replied. "And I take technology that will level the battlefield for conflicts around the world." As they spoke, Mariah had been systematically repositioning herself for what she knew would be the decisive moment of the confrontation. She had clear shots on 2 of Kozlov's men, but the third, the one behind the hostages, remained in a position where any action against him would endanger civilians. The mathematics of the situation were brutal but clear. "Victor," Maria said quietly, "you made one critical error in your planning." "What error?" Kozlov asked, though his voice suggested he was genuinely curious rather than concerned. "You assumed that 3 years of civilian life had made me soft," Maria replied, her voice taking on the cold certainty that had once made her the most feared operator in Delta Force. "You were wrong. In the darkness of the laboratory, surrounded by hostages and advanced weapons technology, the final confrontation between Maria Santos and Viktor Kozlov was about to begin. The laboratory fell into an eerie silence as Maria and Kozlov faced each other across the darkened room. 3 years of unfinished business finally coming to its inevitable conclusion. The emergency lighting cast harsh shadows that transformed the sophisticated research facility into something resembling a battlefield, which Maria realized was exactly what it had become. "You know, Maria," Kozlov said conversationally, his weapon trained on the hostages while his men maintained their tactical positions. "I have spent considerable time studying your operational history. 17 successful missions, 60 lives saved, a perfect record of bringing people home alive." Maria remained in cover behind the computer bank, her mind calculating angles and timing while Kozlov continued his psychological warfare. She could see all 3 hostile positions, but the tactical problem remained unsolvable through conventional means. Any direct action would result in civilian casualties. Kozlov had spotted all 3 of her movements, and tonight her operational frustrations were coming to a head. "Tonight, that perfect record ends," Kozlov continued. "These people will die because you chose to engage rather than allow me to complete my mission peacefully." "Your mission was never going to be peaceful," Maria replied, using her voice to mask the subtle sounds of her movement. "You executed 1 hostage before I even entered the building."
"A demonstration of commitment," Kozlov said dismissively. "Death was never my primary objective. That was simply the cost of American stubbornness." As they spoke, Maria activated one of her more specialized pieces of equipment, a device that technically didn't exist in any official inventory and whose capabilities were classified beyond top secret. The quantum frequency disruptor was designed to interfere with electronic systems in ways that conventional countermeasures couldn't detect or prevent. "You're stalling," Kozlov observed, his voice sharpening with suspicion. "Waiting for your tactical team to breach the facility?" "No," Maria said honestly. "I'm giving you one last chance to surrender before I demonstrate why Delta Force operators don't require backup." Kozlov's laugh was genuine. "Arrogance, Maria. Even you cannot defeat 3 trained operators in defensive positions while protecting 12 hostages. Mathematics is impossible." "The mathematics assume conventional tactics," Maria replied, her finger hovering over the activation switch for the frequency disruptor. "But I wasn't trained for conventional warfare." The device activated silently, sending focused electromagnetic pulses toward the tactical radios and night vision equipment that Kozlov's team was using. Within seconds, their electronic systems began malfunctioning, creating confusion that Maria had been counting on. In the chaos that followed, Maria moved with the lethal precision that had made her legendary. The first hostile went down to a suppressed shot that took advantage of his momentary distraction with malfunctioning equipment. The second found himself facing an enemy who had closed distance while he was struggling with dead night vision, eliminating him before he could raise an alarm. But it was the third operative, the one positioned behind the hostages, who presented the real challenge. As his teammates fell, he pressed his weapon against the nearest civilian's head, using the hostage as a human shield while screaming orders in broken English. "Stop! Stop, or I'll kill them all!" Maria froze, her weapon trained on the operative but unable to take a shot that wouldn't endanger the innocent people he was threatening. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the situation where perfect tactics collided with impossible moral choices. "Victor," she called out, knowing that Kozlov was still somewhere in the laboratory shadows. "Your men are down. It's just you and me now. Let the hostages go, and we'll finish this the way it should have ended 3 years ago." Kozlov's voice came from a position she hadn't expected, revealing that he'd been moving during the engagement. "I think not, Maria. My operative has clear instructions. If I am killed or captured, he eliminates all witnesses before terminating himself."
Maria felt the tactical situation slipping beyond her control. Even if she could neutralize Kozlov, the remaining operative would likely carry out mass executions before she could stop him. The perfect record that Kozlov had mentioned, 17 missions without losing a civilian, was about to end in catastrophic failure. "What do you want?" Maria asked, though she was already formulating desperate contingency plans. "Simple," Kozlov replied. "You surrender your weapon and submit to restraint. In exchange, the hostages live. Well, we complete our extraction." It was a lie, and Maria knew it. Kozlov had no intention of leaving witnesses, regardless of any promises he made. But surrendering would at least buy time for the hostages while she worked through options that didn't exist in any tactical manual. "How do I know you'll keep your word?" Maria asked, slowly lowering her weapon while her mind raced through possibilities. "You don't," Kozlov said honestly, "but you know with certainty what happens if you refuse." Maria set her weapon on the floor and stepped into the emergency lighting where both Kozlov and his remaining operative could see her clearly. For the first time in the engagement, she was completely vulnerable, relying on psychology and timing rather than tactical advantage. "You know what's interesting about Delta Force training?" Maria said conversationally, as Kozlov approached with zip-tie restraints. "They don't just teach you how to kill people, they teach you how to read them, how to understand what they're really thinking versus what they're saying." Kozlov paused, suddenly wary of her calm demeanor. "What is your point?" "My point," Maria said, meeting his eyes directly, "is that your operative behind the hostages is scared. Look at his hands, they're shaking. Look at his positioning. He's already planning his exit strategy rather than focusing on the immediate threat." As she spoke, Maria could see Kozlov's eyes flick toward his remaining teammate, confirming her psychological assessment. The operative was indeed showing signs of stress-induced breakdown, which created the tactical opportunity she'd been waiting for. "You trained him for conventional combat," Maria continued, "but this situation is beyond his experience level. He's going to make a mistake, and when he does—" Maria moved at precisely the moment Kozlov's attention shifted toward his operative. Her backup weapon, a ceramic knife that wouldn't show up on metal detectors, appeared in her hand as if by magic, finding the precise spot between Kozlov's ribs that would incapacitate without killing. Simultaneously, she triggered a flashbang device that she'd positioned during her earlier movement, creating the disorientation necessary to reach the final operative before he could carry out his threats against the hostages. The engagement was over in less than 3 seconds. Both hostile operatives were neutralized, the hostages were secure, and Viktor Kozlov lay unconscious but alive, finally captured after 3 years of pursuit. "Santos to command," Maria spoke into her throat microphone as she secured the laboratory. "All hostiles neutralized. 12 hostiles were safe and accounted for. The facility is secure." Walsh's voice crackled with relief and admiration. "Outstanding work, Santos. Medical and security teams are en route to your position." As Maria began checking on the hostiles, scientists and maintenance workers who looked at her with a mixture of terror and gratitude, she felt the familiar aftermath of successful operations. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of having brought everyone home alive. "Ma'am," said Dr. Jennifer Kim, one of the researchers Maria was helping to untie, "who are you? I mean, your badge says civilian contractor, but what you just did?" Maria smiled, touching the area of her neck where her collar had shifted during the engagement, finally revealing the small tattoo that had been hidden for 11 months. "My name is Maria Santos. I used to clean weapons here at the base." Over the following weeks, Maria's life transformed in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her civilian identity as Sarah Martinez was officially retired, replaced by a new position as Senior Instructor for Advanced Tactical Operations at the Army's Special Operations Command. Instead of hiding her skills, she was now responsible for teaching them to the next generation of elite operators.
The position came with a house on base, security clearances that officially recognized her expertise, and most importantly, the knowledge that her unique capabilities were being used to prepare other soldiers for the impossible missions that would inevitably come. The key to successful hostage rescue, Maria told her first class of special operations candidates, isn't advanced equipment or overwhelming force. It's understanding that every person you're trying to save represents someone's entire world. That personal connection gives you the strength to attempt the impossible. She looked out at the eager faces staring back at her, young soldiers who would soon face their own life-and-death decisions in dangerous places around the world. Your job isn't to be heroes. Your job is to bring heroes home alive, and sometimes that means making sacrifices that no training manual can prepare you for. During a break between classes, Maria received a secure message that made her smile. Viktor Kozlov had been sentenced to life imprisonment after providing intelligence that prevented 3 other operations targeting American military assets. His cooperation had likely saved hundreds of lives, though he would spend the rest of his existence in a maximum security facility. That evening, Maria stood on the balcony of her new home, looking out over Camp Harrison where her journey had begun 11 months earlier. She could see the weapons maintenance facility where she'd spent nearly a year pretending to be someone ordinary, trying to hide from the responsibilities that came with her particular set of skills. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Walsh, her former coworker from the maintenance facility who'd become an unexpected friend during the transition period. Saw your interview in the Army Times. Still can't believe Sarah Martinez turned out to be a legendary special ops soldier. Proud to have known you. Maria typed back, I'm still the same person who cleaned weapons next to you for almost a year. I just stopped pretending that was all I could do. As the sun set over the Nevada desert, Maria realized that she'd finally found the balance she'd been searching for. She was no longer hiding from her past, but she wasn't defined entirely by it either. She was Maria Santos, the operator who'd saved 17 missions worth of lives. She was the instructor who would prepare dozens of soldiers for impossible missions. And she was the woman who'd learned that sometimes the most important transformation was accepting who you really were. The tattoo on her neck, a small phoenix rising from flames, surrounded by symbols representing each successful mission, was no longer hidden beneath carefully arranged collars. It was visible to her students, her colleagues, and anyone else who needed to understand that some people were forged in circumstances that prepared them for extraordinary challenges. Sometimes, the most heroic thing you could do was recognize when it was time to stop hiding and embrace the person you were meant to be. Sometimes, the greatest mission was the one that brought you home to yourself. Maria Santos was finally, completely, and proudly herself. 3 months into her new role, Maria faced a challenge she hadn't anticipated. A young lieutenant named Rebecca Chen approached her after an advanced tactical training session, her expression carrying the kind of uncertainty that Maria recognized from her own early days in special operations. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Chen began hesitantly, "I've been following your career since the Camp Harrison incident became declassified. There's something I need to tell you about my background." Maria gestured for Chen to sit down in her office, noting the nervous energy that reminded her of her own struggles with hidden identity. "What's on your mind, Lieutenant?" Chen pulled back her sleeve, revealing a small tattoo that Maria immediately recognized, the symbol of a classified Navy SEAL unit that officially didn't exist. "I've been living under a false identity for 2 years. My real name is Rebecca Walsh, and I was declared killed in action during a mission in Somalia." Maria felt a surge of understanding mixed with professional concern. Chen's situation was remarkably similar to her own, but the implications were more complex than simple identity concealment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because there are others," Chen said quietly. "At least 6 operators across different branches who've been given new identities after classified missions went sideways. We've been trying to live normal lives, but recent events suggest someone is systematically hunting us." The revelation sent a chill through Maria's newly settled world. If Chen was correct, then Maria's own exposure during the Camp Harrison incident might have put other hidden operators at risk. The question was whether this was coincidence or part of a larger conspiracy.
What kind of evidence do you have? Maria asked, her mind already shifting into analytical mode. Chen pulled out a tablet containing surveillance photos and incident reports. 3 suspicious deaths in the past 6 months. David Martinez in Texas, officially a construction worker, actually former Delta Force. Sarah Johnson in Florida, supposed to be a nurse, really an Army intelligence operative. Marcus Thompson in Colorado, listed as a mechanic, but he was Special Forces. Maria studied the photos, noting details that suggested these weren't random accidents or coincidences. Each death had occurred under circumstances that could be explained as mishaps, but the pattern suggested professional elimination of specific targets. Someone has access to classified records that shouldn't exist, Maria concluded. The kind of information that would identify operators who've been given new identities. Chen nodded grimly. That's what we think, but it gets worse. The person responsible seems to know not just our new identities, but our psychological profiles and tactical capabilities. These weren't sloppy hits. They were operations designed specifically to counter how each target would respond to threats. Maria felt the familiar weight of operational responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her peaceful life as an instructor was about to become significantly more complicated, but people she'd served with were in danger. The choice between personal safety and professional duty wasn't really a choice at all.
How many operators do you think are still at risk? Maria asked. Unknown, Chen replied. The program was compartmentalized, so we don't have a complete list. But if someone has gained access to the master database, there could be dozens of targets. Over the following days, Maria found herself drawn back into the world of classified operations and dangerous adversaries. Working with Chen and other surviving operators, she began investigating the systematic elimination of hidden soldiers, uncovering a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military and intelligence communities. The investigation revealed that a former Pentagon official named Harrison Mitchell had been selling classified information to foreign intelligence services for over 3 years. Among the data he'd compromised were the identity files of operators who'd been given new lives after completing classified missions. Mitchell wasn't just selling routine intelligence, Maria explained to a joint task force that had been hastily assembled to address the security breach. He was specifically targeting the identity program, providing foreign operatives with everything they needed to track down and eliminate American assets who were supposed to be dead. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Mitchell's actions had compromised not just individual operators, but entire networks of assets who'd spent years building civilian covers in various parts of the world. The damage assessment would take months to complete, but early estimates suggested that dozens of lives were at immediate risk. "What's our response protocol?" asked General Patricia Morrison, the task force commander who'd been brought in to coordinate the crisis response. Maria consulted the tactical assessment she'd been developing with Chen and the other survivors. "We have 2 options. We can relocate all compromised operators to secure facilities until the threat is neutralized, or we can use ourselves as bait to draw out the hostile operatives and eliminate them proactively." General Morrison studied the proposal with obvious concern. Using compromised operators as bait is essentially asking them to risk their lives to protect classified programs that officially don't exist. "General," Maria said quietly, "most of us have been risking our lives for programs that don't officially exist for years. The difference now is that we're doing it by choice rather than by orders." The decision to proceed with the proactive operation was made at levels of government that Maria didn't have clearance to know about, but the authorization came down through channels that left no doubt about the mission's importance. Within a week, Maria found herself leading a team of supposedly dead operators in a counterintelligence mission that would either eliminate the threat or result in their actual deaths. The operation culminated in a carefully orchestrated confrontation in Washington, D.C., where Maria's team used themselves as targets to identify and neutralize a network of foreign operatives who'd been systematically hunting American assets. The mission succeeded, but at a cost that reminded Maria why she'd originally chosen civilian life.
2 members of her team were killed during the operation, operators who'd survived years of classified missions only to die protecting the very program that had erased their official existence. Their sacrifice ensured that dozens of other hidden assets could continue living their civilian lives without fear of assassination, but the personal cost weighed heavily on Maria's conscience. Standing in Arlington National Cemetery 6 months later, Maria watched as Rebecca Chen was promoted to captain in a ceremony that couldn't acknowledge her real service record or the classified operations that had earned her the advancement. Like Maria's own recognition, Chen's promotion was based on her cover identity and officially documented achievements rather than her actual contributions to national security. "It's strange," Chen observed as they walked among the headstones of soldiers whose sacrifices were publicly acknowledged, "spending your career protecting people who will never know your name or understand what you've done for them." Maria nodded, understanding the complexity of emotions that came with serving in programs that exist in the shadows of official military operations. "That's not why we do it, though. We do it because someone has to, and we're capable of handling missions that other people can't." As the sun set over the nation's capital, Maria realized that her transformation was still ongoing. She'd evolved from a hidden soldier pretending to be a civilian contractor, to an acknowledged instructor preparing others for classified missions, to a leader coordinating operations that protect the very system that had given her a new life. The small tattoo on her neck had gained new meaning over the past year. Originally, it had marked her as a member of an elite unit that conducted impossible missions. Now, it represented something more complex, a commitment to protecting the hidden warriors who serve their country without recognition or official acknowledgement. Maria Santos had found her true calling, not just as an operator or instructor, but as a guardian of the guardians, ensuring that those who serve in the shadows could do so without becoming targets themselves. Her transformation was complete, but her mission would continue as long as there were people willing to risk everything for causes greater than themselves. In a world where some battles had to be fought by soldiers who officially didn't exist, Maria had become the person who made sure those soldiers could keep fighting. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.